Hello, everyone. My name is Ana Rojas, and I want to welcome you to today's GECO webinar. I want to thank you, participants, and especially our speakers today, because we have a great lineup for the conversation. And also want to extend our thanks to USAID, which is making this series possible thanks to their financial support. Before we get into the matters of today's webinar on addressing gender considerations in large-scale energy infrastructure policies and project development, I would like to run you through a few housekeeping matters. As you may have noticed already, our audience will be kept on mute during the webinar, and this is to avoid disturbances. Because we cannot speak to each other, we would like to encourage you to please send your comments and questions using the chat function. This you can find in the box that is on the right top of your screen. My colleague Maria Prebel would be collecting the questions and comments that you have through the webinar. And she's also able to support you if you have any questions regarding connectivity or if you're having difficulties. So do write to us and we'll do our best to keep you engaged in our webinar. There are also handouts available about today's webinar on the chat box, and Maria will be putting them up soon. And also, as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and its content and the PDF of the presentations you'll be seeing today will be uploaded to the GREEN platform, the Gender and Renewable Energy platform. So give us a couple of hours after we're done with the webinar, and we'll be reaching out to you to let you know when everything is online. I would also like to get started by, for those of you who do not know us, introducing GECO. And this is not, apologies, yes. GECO, which is a 5-year initiative which is implemented by IUCN with the financial support of USAID. And our main goal is to empower women and achieve gender equality and under environmental actions. And under GECO, we have a special energy strand, which has been designed to support the energy sector to be gender responsive, and we are seeking to fill knowledge gaps for integrating gender into the sector, sharing existing practices and ensuring documentation of experiences and new knowledge creation. And today's webinar has been designed to address a series of relatively simple, though always forgotten questions, I would say, because although gender equality and gender mainstreaming has been taking place, particularly in the last decade, the conversations with regards to large-scale energy infrastructure seem to be lagging behind. So whether this concerns job opportunities or access to electricity, or the need to understand how women and men may be profiting differently from compensation and resettlement plans, those discussions have not come to the fore as those that are related to energy access and gender and energy access. So today we would like to discuss a bit more about what are the considerations that we need to take into account for when we're dealing with energy infrastructure projects, but particularly move forward to what it is that we can do and learn about what policies are being designed and how they are being designed to actually cater in a better manner to the needs of women and men, and also learn how financial institutions and cooperation agencies can also play an important role in improving the design and implementation of these projects so that more benefits can be generated for both women and men. And also, of course, because we're going to be having the opportunity to learn from different experiences, we hope that you will be able to take this back home and implement or draw your own conclusion as to what is working or not. And the way we're going to be talking today will be through, we have three great women speakers today. We have Monica Madueke from ECOWAS Regional Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, who's going to share with us how the region, the West African region, is designing gender-responsive energy regulatory instruments. And she'll be followed by Josefina Katrina from the Millennium Challenge Corporation, who's going to share with us how they address at MCC's social and gender considerations through their institutional requirements and policies. So how strong these are and how many results they can achieve. And then we'll be followed by Rachel Aaron from the African Development Bank, who's going to be sharing with us particularly some lessons learned from projects the bank supports, and she's going to be focusing particularly on one in Kenya. So very much looking forward to learning from their experiences. If you're interested in receiving more information about our network, please do reach out to my colleagues or myself, or visit us at the Green and Renewable Energy platform, and you can see the link below. So now, without further ado, it's a pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Monica Madueke, who is a Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Program Officer at the ECOWAS Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, where she coordinates the ECOWAS program on gender mainstreaming in energy access. She has extensive experience in developing regional policies, regulatory and institutional reform instruments for renewable energy, energy efficiency, and gender mainstreaming. She contributed to the development of the ECOWAS policies for renewable energy and energy efficiency, as well as initiated and supervised the development of the ECOWAS policy for gender mainstreaming in energy access, and the ongoing work on producing the ECOWAS directive on gender assessment in energy projects. At ICRI, she has worked on several regional energy programs and projects, serving as regional coordinator for the Global Environment Facility, the GEF Strategic Program for West Africa of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, and as a technical assistant for the Supporting Energy Efficiency for Access in West Africa project. She has a master's degree in energy studies with specialization in energy and the environment from the University of Dundee in Scotland in the UK, and is a member of the International Association for Energy and Economics. Monica, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and we look forward to hearing and learning about ECOWAS. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I would like to thank GECO for this opportunity to talk about this ongoing project being implemented by ECRI. In 2015, ECRI developed the policy for gender mainstreaming in energy access. And at the validation workshop, the member states recommended that we develop a gender code, which will ensure that gender dimensions are included in large-scale energy projects. So my presentation will be mainly looking at the process leading to now. I would like to start by introducing the audience to ECOWAS. ECOWAS stands for the Economic Community of West African States. We're made up of 15 countries, as you can see on the map there. We have a population of roughly over 300 million people. And like most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, universal energy access is still a challenge. It's for this reason that ECRI was established. And for us, the watchword is contributing to sustainable development, either economic, social, and environmental. So as a result of this, gender and energy is something that we work very strongly in. As I mentioned, we came up with this policy, which works to address barriers to the equal participation of women and men in the expansion of energy access in West Africa. As of date, the policy has been adopted by the energy ministers and is currently being presented to the Council of Ministers, and will be presented in a few days to the heads of states for adoption. Now, the policy has a number of objectives, but one of the key objectives is the one on ensuring that projects, programs, and initiatives are non-discriminatory. That is the one that is relevant to the directive I'll be talking about. So how can energy projects be non-discriminatory? Well, first of all, we need to ensure that the impacts do not adversely affect one gender group above the other, and that the benefits of the projects are equally shared. But the discriminatory aspect of energy projects is something that I've found out during the course of my work that is not very clear to a lot of the stakeholders. So in the course of developing the legal instrument, we analyzed 2 case studies of projects implemented in West Africa. We looked at the Bumbuna hydroelectric project, and the other one was the West African gas pipeline. These 2 projects, financed by roughly the same people, had different approaches in mainstreaming gender in their impact assessment. The hydroelectric project ensured that women, as much as men, were consulted. They also ensured that the livelihood assessment and income restoration program was gender sensitive. And as a result of this concerted efforts, the result is that women, as much as men, were identified as beneficiaries. Households reported that witness an improvement in their living conditions and also improvement in their income. The other project, the West African gas pipeline, focused more on improving the competitiveness of the economies of the countries concerned. And although gender was mentioned, wasn't, well, a very, very strong part of the assessments. For example, only 20% of women were consulted. Only 20% of those consulted were actually females. And some of the conclusions arrived were not particularly favorable to women. The idea was that since women owned less land, they were going to lose less as a result of resettlements and loss of lands. So compensations were directed to the heads of the households, which were men. And a year after the construction of the project, which started in 2005, the community lodged a complaint that the project was going to lead to damages on their environment and also on livelihoods. So with an additional contribution of $11 million, the project was able to achieve social inclusion. The main story from this case study comparison is that we can't leave something as important as gender mainstreaming to the whims of the project team members. But of course, we're also concerned about coming up with new regulations that might be counterproductive to already a difficult investment environment. Excuse me. So in order to go on with this project to develop a legal instrument, we had to ask ourselves some very key questions. We wanted to know, for example, what is the current regulatory framework as it pertains to energy infrastructure development. We didn't want to duplicate in case something already existed. And looking at the regional and national level, we saw that there was a gap, indeed a very large gap. For example, although in the electricity and petroleum sector, project developers were mandated to conduct environmental impact assessments, they were not required to include gender, or that their social impact assessments should have gender disaggregated analysis. So we wanted to find out from those really involved in projects why this was so, what was the level of awareness and perceived importance of gender assessments. Through an online survey that was part of the background study to develop the directive, we found out from our key stakeholders, which are the managers or project developers working in West Africa, that the lack of awareness, interest, expertise, and a regulatory instrument on gender impact assessment contributed to the absence of gender impact assessments in energy infrastructure projects. So to find out why it wasn't necessarily considered as important, the questions showed that the responses from the questions posed showed that the lack of understanding of the linkages between gender and energy infrastructure and the lack of gender disaggregated data on impacts contributed to this feeling of less importance, which I can relate to from my work since I've been coordinating this program. you tend to see that people are interested in gender mainstreaming or conducting gender assessments, but they don't really understand why we need to. Unlike climate change impacts that are very obvious because mainstream media, they carry it on BBC, on CNN, you see pictures of the impacts on climate change. It's still elusive how gender interfaces with energy infrastructure projects. So a lot of our respondents thought that it was very, very important on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very important. A lot of the respondents thought that it was very important for us to regulate gender impact assessments. And in terms of the approach of its implementation, more than half of those who responded thought that it should be a standalone regulation rather than it being integrated into an already existing regulation like the environment impact assessments. Those who thought that it should be a standalone regulation argued that it will make it more effective and it will be taken more seriously. So, of course, as expected, more than half of those who responded thought that it should be under the purview of the energy ministries to ensure that gender impact assessments are conducted and enforced. So, given these responses, we're encouraged to move forward with the project to develop the legal instrument, but we still needed to ask ourselves some key questions, whether to go for a directive or a regulation. Now, directives are more flexible in implementation in the sense that once the member states have adopted these directives, they decide how they want to achieve those objectives. Whereas regulations, well, they adopt word for word and they need to implement what they've adopted. We decided to go for a directive because we feel that the institutions, they have different level of development and ability to implement something that is so ironclad. And also, we feel that we have a lot to learn because we didn't have a lot of examples. There are not a lot of examples existing out there on gender assessments, and member states have a lot to learn. So we decided to go for a directive. But another thing about the directive is that the member states need to develop their own national laws to start enforcing it. So the deal about the directive is that before energy infrastructure projects are carried out, the development concept to carry out those projects are based on gender assessments of impacts. And certain criteria need to be looked at, the differences between men and women when it comes to displacement, loss of livelihoods. The second one is the basic and strategic gender needs of the communities, like, for example, education, protecting against human trafficking, also health and security issues. Assessments also need to be conducted along the lines of women's social representation, empowerment, and participation in the energy project development. And it's important also that they look at women and men's access to resources in the community and also in the project. Of course, these are just minimum criteria. We expect that member states can, have more stringent criteria if they choose to. And in that directive, we have other criteria for assessment report, management plan, etc. I won't go into this. Now, later this month, we'll be validating this directive. So I guess what we're doing right now is a pre-validation workshop where we'll be bringing together the member states, the ministries of energy, the regulators, and we'll be debating on what we've drafted. And another exciting part about the workshop is that we'll be having a training session on regulating gender assessments, because as I mentioned, the knowledge about the linkages is still something that is very, very elusive. So we brought together a wonderful team. I must say that I'm very proud of those who've worked on this project. It's not just an ECRI thing, because if we want to ensure that gender is mainstreamed in large-scale energy projects, then people like the West African Power Pool, the regulators, and other key ECOWAS agencies need to be involved, and they were really involved. And of course, we got a lot of financial assistance from Power Africa, the United States National Renewable Energy Laboratory, the Austrian Development Agency, and the Spanish Development Corporation. we got very strong technical partners. And for implementing partners, that is open. We hope that as this directive is adopted, that a lot of you who are working in this member states will work with the countries to ensure that gender becomes mainstream in large energy projects. I want to thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Hello.
Hi, Monica. Sorry about that. There was some issues with the mic. It was very nice to, great to listen to your presentation, and two things struck me the most. One, the need to dedicate attention, or the need to have gender disaggregated data to still make a strong case as to why this is important. And second, how big an effort ICRI and ECOWAS in that sense are going through in terms of putting together a regional directive for addressing gender, particularly in large scale energy infrastructures. So with that, I hope I can inspire our audience to start sending us their comments and questions using the chat bar. And now I would like to transition to our second speaker. Her name is Josefina Katrina, and she is an associate director with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, a U.S. foreign aid agency, where she works to integrate social inclusion and gender equality perspectives into funded activities. While at MCC, she has worked in various countries, including Indonesia, Kosovo, Moldova, Mongolia, Tanzania, Tunisia, and the Philippines, on projects that range from large infrastructure investments, such as roads or electrification projects, to vocational education, land, and agriculture. Prior to this, she worked on gender for the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation. Her main focus was gender and private sector development, including increasing women's access to finance and reducing gender barriers in the investment climate. She was part of a team that coordinated a World Bank initiative led by the World Bank president, bringing together international companies with major corporate social responsibility and women's empowerment initiatives, such as Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, and Boeing. She received her BA from Stanford University and a master's in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where she was active in the Harvard Women and in Public Policy program. Josefina, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you with us, and we're looking forward to learning more about how MCC is working towards social and gender integration.
Thank you so much. So let me dive in right away. Why does MCC focus on social and gender inclusion in infrastructure? Well, first of all, it's to ensure compliance with our policy and requirements. About 70% of our funds end up going to infrastructure projects. So we've really had to make an effort to incorporate social and gender issues into those. And the energy sector has been a growing share of that portfolio. We have committed $1.5 billion in Power Africa countries alone, and apart from that, have energy sector investments in other countries like Nepal or Indonesia. And the kinds of projects we fund are electricity generation and distribution infrastructure, such as substations or electricity lines, renewable energy solutions, and also work to strengthen sector institutions. In these kinds of projects, there's both a significant amount of social and gender risks, but also opportunities. Monica spoke briefly about the resettlement risks, which we encounter quite significantly in our projects, because really every country where I've worked, at least, there's a gender imbalance in asset ownership. So we've had to work to incorporate considerations into resettlement action plans and compensation practices. And then also we try to maximize opportunities and benefits to women through, for example, temporary employment in construction, and considering the fact that women oftentimes use infrastructure in ways that are just not considered during design, and therefore designs end up being not tailored as they could be to meet those differential needs. Now, a little bit of what our policy and operational requirements are, and I won't go into detail into each one of these, but just highlight a couple. We have had a gender policy since 2006, but I'll highlight instead the trickle-down operational requirements that result from the policy and that make it more concrete. For example, countries that we work with are required to put together a social and gender integration plan, and in that plan to detail how specifically they will address the risks and the disparities in access to benefits. And that's done in the first year of the 5-year compact cycle, meaning an attention must be paid early on to incorporate issues into project design. And the other issue I'll highlight here is our standard bidding documents. In order for a country we work with to procure services or any construction works, they have to use these bidding documents to hire contractors. And these bidding documents, we have modified what was a standard template to include a number of specific gender clauses that highlight to bidders and eventual contractors our requirements on gender. And I won't read this in detail on this slide, but we basically require them to comply with both our gender policy and the social and gender integration plans with the detailed activities, gender-specific activities in there. And then we monitor and oversee that in the course of the 5 years. Now, the entry points range from the early stages of doing environmental and social impact assessments, where we ask for usually carry out separate gender assessments within those or complementary gender assessments, through detailed designs, resettlement, and then construction works. Now, in the energy sector in particular, in the efforts to expand access to things like electricity distribution, generation and distribution infrastructure, we've noticed a number of gender disparities that merit attention. And I have here an image from with some data from Tanzania. In Tanzania, we commissioned a household energy survey in preparation for a project, and we sex disaggregated all the data and found a number of gender inequalities in it. As you can see, among the households that already had electricity, female-headed households were a very, very tiny share, only 5% compared to 43% of male-headed households. And this was directly related to the higher poverty levels. And so it made it clear to us that we needed to incorporate specific measures to address this disparity in the way we designed the project. Also in sex disaggregating the same survey, and looking at the pattern of household energy expenses, we saw that 2/3 of a household's energy expense was cooking related. And obviously this is a highly gendered task, because in Tanzania in particular, women and children are primarily responsible for fetching firewood. And yet following the introduction of electricity, this did not change. So households continued to cook using firewood, and yet the part of the economic premise of our projects was that there would be household savings because of a change in energy expenses, and yet 2/3 of the energy expense actually wasn't changing, and the big gender burden we expected to change would not change, at least in the immediate term. In doing the environmental and social impact assessments or resettlement planning, we've also noticed that generally information meetings are attended by men, and so we've incorporated measures such as separate meetings with women to make sure their voices are incorporated into the process. And again, same Tanzania survey found in terms of productive uses, out of the, we did a separate survey for enterprises, and about half of those who had home-based enterprises were women. And yet women were also more likely to report that they couldn't afford electricity and could not afford appliances. And so another economic premise of our projects had been that there would be productive gains through our activities, and yet so it wasn't necessarily so simple as this demonstrated. Now, in the course of doing environmental and social impact assessments, communities have highlighted a number of risks, and I'll walk through some of those. For example, construction workers seeking sex partners, which increases the risks of HIV/AIDS in pregnancy, risks of children playing with equipment during construction, or thefts of parts and equipment. People also reported going near the areas that are lit by security lights, by substations, to read and do homework, since there was no lighting elsewhere. There were also risks of children playing around substations, or women using them to dry their laundry in agricultural products. Finally, we heard of project vehicles transporting children, not in our project specifically, but risks of this arising and elsewhere, transporting children and underage girls for illegal purposes. And then the resettlement risk, which I already discussed a little bit. So how have we worked to address some of these risks and issues? On the improving uptake of electricity, one key solution is to look at, in some of the countries where we work, Tanzania was one example, the connection fee and the wiring fee alone will be easily 6 months worth of a poor person's income. So unless you address that issue, you are excluding the poor from being able to benefit. We also have advocated for and managed to obtain complementary projects to enhance productive use of electricity, focusing in particular on women-owned businesses, given this assumption that they will automatically use electricity for productive purposes doesn't pan out. In terms of the construction contracts and addressing some of the social risks, the contracts themselves already have these clauses, which I briefly talked about earlier, but it's important to be as detailed and specific as possible in terms of the technical specifications for works. And I have here just a few of the examples of things that we have incorporated in the past into those. For example, trafficking in person risk management plans. MCC has an anti-trafficking in persons policy, and if there is the policy notes that if the risk is heightened, we have to come up with at a minimum a no tolerance policy and approach to addressing it. There have also been design modifications. We have tried to emphasize the hiring of female labor in the construction contracts, though that has been more of a mixed experience. It's worked really well in some places, less well in others. There's a women in construction pilot that we are in the process of implementing right now in select countries to try to do better on this, requiring contractors to adopt sexual harassment policies, female-friendly facilities on site, since otherwise you may have a difficult time retaining some of these female employees you're trying to have on site, and intense community engagement and education campaigns on critical issues. In terms of the sectoral work, and I'll mention this because it generally is done as a complement to the infrastructure investments. It's important from a sustainability perspective in particular. We have also done gender assessment of utilities and sectoral policies. And I think this is a nice complement to what Monica was talking about at a broader level. At a country level, we've done gender audits of utilities, number of utilities. And generally what arises out of that is, as she noted, sectoral policy generally is gender blind. And what struck me in particular is that there's very little understanding of what the business case is for addressing gender at the utility level is. I feel like saying gender is important because it's the right thing to do is fine, but what will really capture the attention of a utilities management is knowing how this will make a difference to the institutional bottom line and to the institutional performance. And we have also seen, even when there's been some interest to addressing these issues in the context of our projects, generally it's been confined to HR, and they seem to understand that there's an HR dimension to gender, but apart from it, there was little. And the other thing that has really struck me is the extremely limited disaggregated data in the energy sector. Both, and none of the utilities I worked with have collected disaggregated data, and it's been difficult to do so. And therefore, the patterns about inequality in use and needs don't really, we have a difficult time highlighting unless we commission separate survey. And to address some of these things, we have been doing technical assistance for sector institutions across a number of dimensions, developing gender policies. We just did approved one for Malawi, which with lots of women singing at the event, collecting and disaggregating customer data, supporting gender responsive consumer outreach and consumer relations. And that's really it from my end. And just as a takeaway message from me, is to say that in order to make gender requirements and infrastructure work, one should be as concrete and specific as possible in outlining what those requirements are and translating them into contracts, into project documents and expectations. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Josefina. It's been great listening to you, and I want to take not only your final remarks, but also two other things you said. One, the need to have disaggregated data, because without that, we cannot move forward. And it was extremely interesting to see how, from the example in Tanzania, you were able to compare the assumptions from a project and improve its original design. So hopefully we can hear a little bit more about that during the Q&A session and learn how that was translated into implementation. And now I would like to remind you, our audience, to please continue sending in your questions through the chat function. Do try to be specific in terms of context, so that when we put forward the question to our panelists, it is clear to them what it is that you're referring to specifically. And now I'd like to change another gear again and invite Rachel Aaron as a panelist. Rachel is a Principal Social Development Specialist at the African Development Bank Group. She is responsible for mainstreaming social development concerns, primarily in private sector operations and also in public sector operations. She is responsible for undertaking social assessments and analysis of projects, programs, and ensuring compliance with the bank's environmental and social safeguards. She's actively engaged in innovative work related to environmental, social, and gender matters for the Climate Investment Funds, the Global Environment Facility, and the Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa on behalf of the bank. Prior to joining the bank, Rachel worked for Africare, the League of Kenya Women Voters, the World Health Organization, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and other institutions. She has an MA in International Development from American University in Washington in the US, with specialization in community development and gender. Rachel, the floor is yours, and we can see your two screens for the presentation. Feel free to get started.
You're saying you can see the two screens or the main screen?
We see two sets of slides.
Oh wow. Okay, just hold on 1 minute. Do you see one now?
No, but it should be fine.
Okay, no problem. Sorry, I think it's a setup because the way it's held. Sorry, everybody. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Rachel Aaron. The African Development Bank, AFDB, has the objective to spur sustainable economic development and progress in its region member countries, contributing to poverty reduction, I think it just went off. Hello?
Rachel, we can hear you, but we've lost half of your screen. We seem to be experiencing some difficulties with you.
Hold on. It just went off. Sorry, can you see me now?
We still have some odd patches. Yes, we're back. Okay. Let me know if you want me to share the screen for you instead.
Okay, can you share the screen for me? Maybe that might be better.
Yes. Maria, could you please help us take care of it? Rachel, we're all set. Just let me know when you need me to change the slides.
Okay, so everything is set now?
Yes, it is. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. So you're changing them now, or I am, just to be sure. Sorry about that.
I changed the slides, so you just have to let me know when you need me to change the slides.
Okay, perfect. So excuse me, everybody. So AFDB's objective is to spur sustainable economic development and social progress in its member countries across Africa, all 50 countries. Our portfolio focuses on a diversity of sectors, most of which center on infrastructure investments in both the public and private sector, as well as private sector investments in other areas. Obviously, energy infrastructure is a key component. Next slide, please. Sorry, I can't tell from the screen. Is the next slide up?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thanks. The bank's robust policy foundation allows us to define how we mainstream gender in the energy sector. We are guided by our 10-year strategy of 2013 to 2022, as well as our high 5 priority areas, one of the key ones being Light Up and Power Africa. We're also guided by our energy sector policy, the strategy for the New Deal on Energy for Africa, and our gender strategy. Next slide, please. Gender is an important cross-cutting issue that is addressed in all of our policy and programmatic interventions. Through our project due diligence process, we're able to mainstream gender in our public and private sector investments. We have 3 main entry points, one of which is the integrated safeguard system, that is our environmental and social, ENS standards, different checklists, one of which focuses on the infrastructure sector, and we're currently developing one specifically for the energy sector, and the readiness review, which is a quality entry mechanism that allows us to assess gender in our project concept notes and our project appraisal reports. Next slide, please. Through our due diligence process, we have a list of a whole set of tools, methodologies, and guidelines that enable us to identify, analyze, integrate, and monitor and evaluate gender considerations. So in this presentation, I'll be focusing on the Menengai Geothermal Development Project in Kenya in East Africa. My presentation will demonstrate how our policies and due diligence process were applied to transition from theory to practice and effectively mainstreaming gender in the design of this project, which we consider to be a transformative, innovative, and landmark renewable energy project. The project is situated in the African Rift System, about 180 kilometers from Nairobi, the Kenyan capital, and it's located on the Menengai caldera, which has immense geothermal potential. Next. This is just to give you an idea of the map where Africa is and obviously where the project is located within Africa, within Kenya. Next. The project was approved by our board of directors in December 2011. A total amount of financing of $150 million were provided, 125 million through a loan through our concessionary window, and $25 million through a combined loan and grant through the climate investment funds, which we also host. The implementing agency for this project is the Geothermal Development Company, GDC, that's wholly owned by the Kenyan government. The project is currently under the status of supervision. So in terms of the project's objectives, the main objective is to develop the Menengai geothermal steam field to produce enough steam for a power plant that will be operated by the private sector. Of the several objectives of the project, the key ones are to increase geothermal energy production capacity by 400 megawatts and to provide reliable, clean, and affordable electricity supply to 500,000 households and 300,000 micro-enterprises. Next. The project components included site civil works, equipment, well drilling, a steam gathering system, consultancy services, and environmental and social management. Next. We addressed gender at varied levels of the project and made sure we integrated into both the project design and implementation modalities. We undertook a comprehensive gender assessment as part of the ENS due diligence. This was aimed to understand gender dynamics, relations, and inequalities and inequities at household, community, national, and sectoral levels. It also served to allow us to comprehend energy sources, usage, and consumption trends, and to capture the findings in the project documentation. We also collected available gender disaggregated data and statistics in order to ascertain the socioeconomic and sociocultural characteristics of the local communities, including women, girls, and other vulnerable groups, and to allow us to identify gap areas for desired gender data and statistics. Next. We also address gender by designing an inclusive and gender-sensitive stakeholder engagement and public consultation processes. This served to facilitate the participation and inputs of women and organizations representing gender interests, such as civil society. We also established a new gender-sensitive baseline and formulated gender-sensitive project indicators, some of which included the project employment ratio, where we set a target at 30% women, the number of trainees on drilling technologies and geoscience, where we also set a target of 30% women, and obviously related to beneficiaries of GDC's complementary initiatives in different areas. In addressing gender, we also developed M&E mechanisms for ENS indicators, including indicators with gender implications. In addressing gender, we made sure we integrated the different gender aspects we assessed into all of the ENS documentation, such as environmental and social impact assessment, the environmental and social management plan, which served to mitigate social risk and gender risk, as well as to monitor community impacts with social and gender implications. We also integrated gender aspects into the GDC's corporate social responsibility policy and guidelines, just to make sure that we created income generation and job creation of projects with a main focus on women and the youth. Finally, we designed with GDC innovative complementary initiatives that serve to develop not only community action plans, but to establish a regional geothermal training institute to build the capacities of professionals in Kenya and regionally. Next. Through GDC's innovative complementary initiatives that I spoke of just now, they serve to utilize geothermal resources such as the steam and water with the aim of achieving distinct social and gender benefits for the local communities. These included promoting greenhouse farming, aloe vera farming, fish farming, pyrethrum farming, milk processing, and improved pasture land. The initiatives also serve to enable the drying of grains and cereals, to establish ecotourism activities such as heated spas and saunas to increase tourism, and to support rainwater harvesting in schools. Women's prominent presence in a number of these activities would obviously serve to economically empower them and their households, and the project also expanded their choices not only for employment but livelihoods by not relegating them to traditional or domesticated roles. Next. Now, as I mentioned a wide variety of approaches that we use to gender mainstreaming, and these approaches are expected to result in the following gender benefits and outcomes once the project is completed and once, of course, our loan is fully repaid. So one of them is to employ 30% of women in the project works and activities, which sets a very high standard for small Kenyan towns, to promote direct and indirect employment opportunities for women and contribute to employing them, economically empowering them, enhancing women's participation in traditionally male-dominated fields, such as building stone quarries, ballast crushing, and sand harvesting sectors, to reduce the risk of indoor pollution and the burden of household chores, such as cooking and other tasks, for women and girls through access to energy, to increase the provision of clean domestic water through the transfer of a portable water facility to the community and the rehabilitation of water pans by GDC, and of course, ease the time allocated by women and girls to water collection, to improve health and education opportunities, particularly for women and girls by lighting up schools, clinics, and other socio-cultural infrastructure, and to promote capacity building and knowledge creation in geothermal energy generation, and technologies for professionals, including female professionals within Kenya and regionally. Now, finally, I think it's important to highlight that we as AFDB have learned a number of lessons in transitioning from gender mainstreaming theory to practice in our energy infrastructure projects in both the public and private sector over the years. I'd like to highlight some of those key lessons. There's a lack and/or limited gender data and information that is specifically tailored to the energy sector in African countries. There must be flexibility to instill innovative approaches and concepts at various stages and levels in the design and implementation of projects, and not have an over-reliance on tools, methodologies, and guidelines availed by financing institutions such as ourselves. Greater efforts must be made to obtain and/or analyze qualitative gender information, especially in bringing out sociocultural conditions, such as those linked to religion and ethnicity and others that have both direct and indirect gender impacts on project beneficiaries. Promoting gender-sensitive stakeholder engagement will not only enhance project ownership, but will also ameliorate social interactions and deepen social capital in local communities, including amongst women, girls, and other vulnerable groups. And now this final set of lessons next is ENS studies can serve as reliable data sources for assessing and integrating gender considerations into projects if the studies are prepared in a gender-responsive manner. Robust and gender-sensitive socioeconomic baselines should be established prior to the commencement of construction activities to enable the collection of relevant information on gender and energy linkages. There's need to better deconstruct what we mean by women, girls, and other groups that are marginalized in order to uncover the different layers of vulnerability, such as social, cultural, political, and economic vulnerability, and sufficiently address them through the projects. And finally, and most importantly, gender mainstreaming must center on community needs and interests, both practical and strategic, and not primarily on the desires of project sponsors like GDC or financing institutions like AFDB. Next. So moving forward, just wanted to share with you some pictures of what the project consists of. And next. And finally, to thank you for your time, attention, and interest in the African Development Bank Group, and apologies for the technical difficulties in the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. It's been a pleasure to be able to listen to your presentation. And it seems that somehow today technology is not helping us because we all seem to be having a little bit of glitches here and there. But I'm glad it's not affecting the conversation or the content of the presentations for that matter. It was really interesting to listen about the project in Kenya and how the bank has been working towards addressing gender in the projects, but most importantly, perhaps how lessons have been learned. And perhaps later on, we can have a little bit of conversation as to how this is being translated into other projects that the African Development Bank may be supporting. I would like to get started with the question and answers session as we speak. And I do have a question for our first presenter. Monica, if you could unmute yourself. When you were doing your presentation, you mentioned that there were several team partners. I believe it was towards the end of it. And the question is, if you also included women's rights groups or NGOs as part of your partners in the process of developing or identifying the policy in ECOWAS.
Yes, of course. During the information gathering, we had a broad group of people we spoke to. And even at this validation workshop, we are getting a lot of interest from NGOs, especially women organizations, who will be participating and deliberating on what we've drafted. So it's standard practice for us to, as much as possible, have women's voices heard in all our policy instruments. When we developed the policy, it was the same thing. We reached out to NGOs, and right now with the directive, the same thing. So yes, we have that covered.
Thank you, Monica. Josefina, our audience would like to know a little bit more about the way that your policy is included into the subcontracts. And I guess this refers to, you had a slide with text that was related on how to, bring everyone together. So if you could perhaps take a couple of minutes to help us dive into what this means?
Sure, I'm very happy to, and thank you for the question. So basically, the reason why these bidding documents, which I referenced, and construction that we use, or that our countries that we partner with use to hire works contractors is important, is because that's really the way the majority of the funds are in the course of implementing a project spent. For example, let's say we're constructing a substation somewhere and that costs $50 million. There will be a $30–40 million contract for someone to construct it. And so the way that we went through a process of reviewing all these bidding documents, maybe it was 3 years ago, and we have a set of them for large works and a set of them for small works. Large works is anything $10 million and over, and small works is $10 million or less. And there's a number of clauses in different sections of it. There's a clause that I presented to you on that one slide, which asks the bidders or the contractors to comply with our social and gender integration plan. But then there are other clauses. There's a clause on non-discrimination and equal opportunity. I believe the World Bank has a very similar, if not the same, almost the same clause. We slightly changed it in their standard bidding documents, and it's comes from the ISA performance standards language on non-discrimination. There's a sexual harassment clause. The clause, and this is really to address the fact that in many of our construction contracts, we are trying to find meaningful efforts to employ more women, and yet at the same time, these construction contracts and the employment that they generate is mostly male-dominated employment. And so when you bring in additional women into the mix, there needs to be some safeguards put in place. There's a clause on trafficking in persons. This is to put us in line with broader U.S. government directives on anti-trafficking in persons. And this is a clause that requires a minimum compliance through requiring all construction companies to at a minimum adopt a zero tolerance policy on trafficking in persons. And if there's a high risk deemed in the context of our project, which oftentimes, for example, transport projects would lead to a higher risk, they're required to put in place other measures, for example, educating their workforce on the issue. So those are just a few of the examples, but our website actually has the bidding documents themselves. And if people are interested, they can go online and find the documents. And it's a very long 200–300 page document, but in there are these clauses, and I'm happy to separately provide additional information to anyone who is interested. But we have found those to be incredibly impactful because they are contractual, they bind the contractors, and we can enforce it through then the implementation.
Thank you. And I think that is one of the strongest tools that you may have, that you have a contract and you can actually enforce those clauses. It's good to know that institutions are moving to that extent. Rachel, I have a question for you. The one I have in front of me reads as follows. What guides you, and this was in relation to the Menengai project, of course, what guides you to set the 30% employment benchmark for women in the project?
Okay. Thank you for that. The 30% benchmark was actually went into line with the new Kenyan constitution at the time. And because that was what was the provision in the Constitution, we knew the quota was much lower in the rural areas where the project is actually being realized. We felt that with the premises of striving for even greater and a lot of measures being integrated into the project, we would work to be able to achieve that. So that's where it came from.
Thank you very much. Let me see. Monica, I have another question for you here. It says, how do you envision the implementation of women's social representation, empowerment, and participation in project activities? Could you provide a concrete example? And I'll be happy to read the question again if you need me to.
Yeah, just to make sure I got everything. The question is, how do we envision women's participation in project activities?
Yeah, it reads as follows. How do you envision the implementation of women's social representation, So yes, the participation, I would say, empowerment and empowerment in project activities. And maybe you can give a couple of examples if you have them at hand.
Yeah. I guess, frankly, ensuring that that happens is not so difficult. I couldn't really go into the case study of the Buguna hydroelectric project, but this was a project that was able to do that because, for example, they set out, having a benchmark to have a certain percentage of women interviewed. They wanted to have at least 50% of women spoken to. At the end, they were able to reach 45%. And also, they looked at the social economic situation of women, considering that, looking at the community level, what are women's strengths and weaknesses, and designing response plans aligned to that. For example, the resettlement committee that was set up by the project made sure that they had at least 1/3 of women represented, and that certain senior positions, at least 1 or 2 senior positions, were filled by women. So there are examples of project teams that decide that these are our benchmarks and work towards achieving that. I don't frankly see this as a problem, but I think the main barrier here is that people don't perceive it as important because it's not enforced. There's no condition that you must interview a certain percentage of women. You must have a certain percentage of women represented in your consultation group. So that is the reason why we don't have a lot of that happening. So the idea is that with this directive, and hopefully the member states coming up with laws that mandate that, we want as much as possible a gender balanced consultation process. We want to have women's voices represented, and we want to see how you ensure this through the assessment report and management plan that would have to be presented by the project developer. Then I can see that happening. So I think the main thing, just to reiterate, the main thing for us is to have those conditions set down by the member states through this regional directive, to have it set down and to enforce it. And I feel that women will be willing to participate in energy projects. It just depends on the approach. Another thing I wanted to mention about that Buguna project is that the project team came up with an interesting way of involving women. They had a mixed gender group consultation where they listened to men and women in the same room. Then they had a women-only group so that women's voices could be heard. So it's really about people having a target, the project team coming up with a target, because there's a condition that they need to meet those targets. Then people will come up with very innovative ways to achieve those targets. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. And I have a question that I would like to direct to Josefina, but Rachel and Monica, if you want to add, I would like to hear your voices too on that. It says that here in the West, we have clauses such as equality of pay in the US and Europe, yet we still have huge gender pay gaps. And the question is, how do you enforce the clauses you're talking about, for example, in construction contracts? How do you make sure that women and men are receiving a fair and equal payment? I know it's a tough one, but Josefina, I'm not sure if you want to give it a try.
Yes, happy to. So I think the 2 clauses that are most directly relevant to the question in our standard bidding documents are the sexual harassment clause and the non-discrimination and equal opportunity clause. The non-discrimination and equal opportunity clause talks about not discriminating based on gender or sexual orientation. It doesn't specifically touch upon the subject of equal pay for equal work. It's a very important subject, but it just does not. I think in the context of our projects, in a particular construction contract, let's say, aggregating across countries, it's thousands of jobs that are created. They're temporary jobs, but they're still jobs, and many of them. In any specific contractor, it will be a few hundred. I would say, at a time. And getting women to be even more than just a few % of that employment and to not just be the administrative staff is very hard. And just to be perfectly frank, we've had quite a struggle with just getting that percentage figure up. And oftentimes, the jobs, it's been a struggle to get them into the positions that are not just administrative or the obvious one, let's say such regulating traffic, but into more skilled positions, like to be a welder or a surveyor on a construction site. But we have not been enforcing the equal pay for equal work. In fact, actually, that's not part of the clause. And the sexual harassment clause basically says that sexual harassment will not be tolerated if a particular country in which we work has equal pay for equal work legislation, then that's something that can be followed up on that particular basis. But we haven't been specifically working in that dimension in the context of construction.
Okay, thank you. And Rachel, I'm not sure how if this was also a topic addressed at the Men and Guy project.
Okay.
Or
Let
if
me
there's
speak
something you would like to share.
beyond
Yep.
just beyond Men and Guy in general. It's the same thing with us, that labor issues are tricky. So when we put in the clause in the contract, we haven't included any specific clauses with respect to equal pay for equal work. A lot of it has to do with obviously the context of the country and the legislation regulations. However, since we approved in 2013 our integrated safeguard systems, we have a greater focus on labor issues in general in our projects. So we're looking more in depth in the labor issues, labor arrangements, and also how to integrate more specifically gender when it comes to the allocation of unskilled, semi-skilled, and skilled labor. What you find in general in our projects across Africa is just the thresholds are set in terms of depending on the type of labor, as the type of position and the requirements. However, to bring women to the table so they can be recruited beyond just traditional roles or beyond just unskilled labor in our energy infrastructure projects, we have to bring in incentives. So we haven't really, when we're auditing our projects, heard or dealt too much of unequal pay. It's more, let's say, distinguishing men or women. It's just a differentiation depending on whether it's skilled labor, unskilled labor, semi-skilled. That's generally it. But the point is well taken. It's probably an area ourselves and other MDBs, multilateral development institutions, and bilateral agencies need to look into in the future.
Thanks. And Rachel, I want to ask you to stay on the line because there is a question that came also for you, and it's related to what you were just saying. The question is that in your projects, for example, as this one in Kenya, if you've faced challenges in terms of clashing with social norms, for example, upsetting traditional gender roles and how this is taken, because of course there is an intervention on the ground. And I was wondering if you could reflect on this a little.
If I talked about that, we can talk about it all day. No, it's a serious challenge. It's a serious challenge. I think too, and within Men and Guy, first of all, Men and Guy is in an area of Kenya that's rural, quite conservative and traditional, and has certain social norms and expectations. So even trying to encourage women to, let's say, engage in activities around the project, direct and indirect, that involved enhancing their literacy rates, enhancing their economic empowerment, basically engaging in work that's, let's say, not soft work, but harder work in the sense of, let's say, not your traditional just clearing bushes, going into other, let's say, scientific testing, other work alongside engineers and other capacities. Those were challenging social norms. However, if you want to achieve true social progression and the elevation of women's status, and obviously other groups, vulnerable groups in Africa, you have to challenge social norms. I'm speaking as an African woman myself, working obviously in the African context. So even when we come to appraise as a part of the bank's project team, they are, let's say, perceptions that people have towards myself working on the project team and some of the things that we might be advocating. However, and that's, let's say, at my level. So obviously at a lower level and other levels and political, social spheres and the dynamics of the communities, those play out. So we face a lot of challenges. The social challenges can be in terms of ethnicity. when you're dealing with in community areas where you have more than one ethnic group, which was the case, obviously, in the Menengai area. You also deal with, let's say, when there's religion involved in terms of different religious identities, formal and otherwise. You also deal with, let's say, at household level, what are the cultural practices at the household, within each village, versus, let's say, the urban areas. You deal with the different layers of different things. So there are always social challenges, even with the project sponsor. What we're lucky about in the Menengai project, GDC is an employer that recognizes the importance of promoting gender equality, and at different ranks, whether we're dealing with their own staff, their own technical staff, administrative staff, their corporate social responsibility, community development projects, they understood the importance of gender. And we're also dealing with a country, Kenya, in which civil society is extremely active, especially also in the gender sphere. So that helped us in the stakeholder consultation. So in summary, yes, it's a challenge. Yes, it'll continue to be a challenge, but it doesn't deter us as African Development Bank by doing what we feel might be beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm also thinking about, what am I thinking? I'm thinking about 1,000 things because there are a lot of questions that are coming in. But I wanted to ask Monica, if you could also perhaps reflect a little bit on challenging. No, let me rephrase that. Monica, in your last question, you mentioned that there is a settlement or resettlement commission, right? As part, as some of the new structures that you are looking into in the directive. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more in terms of not only the participation of women in that commission, but how you foresee that resettlement plans could be improved to be more gender responsive. So perhaps that is something that I would throw your way, and also perhaps we could have Josefina afterwards share with us a bit more of her experience with regards to resettlement plans and MCC. Monica, you like? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks again for that question. But before I just go in there, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the one about equal pay. Of course, it's very discriminatory for a woman and a man to be given the same job and for them to have the same qualifications, but one is being paid more than the other. And it all goes back now to the provisions in the national laws when it comes to payment and equity. So for the project, for this directive, which works to ensure that there's equity and equality in our projects, the way we can ensure this is by monitoring when those projects are designed. The competent authority, of course, this directive or the regulation at the member states level will be implemented by the member states, not ECRI. We're more of a policy think tank, but the implementation will really lie at the member states level. What the member states could do, the competent authority, is to ensure that they adequately analyze the assessments and the mitigation plans. How are these project developers going to respect labor laws and human rights laws? So the onus lies again on the member states. When you've come up with laws for equity, you need to ensure that. I like the example that this is the reality in the West. Every time we listen to the news about unequal pay in the West, so it's interesting to see that gender inequality is in developed inequality issues happen in developed countries and also in developing countries. So again, I just want to say that it really lies on the authority to ensure that if it has set this policy or law, that it follows up with it. And one issue I know that women may face in terms of being able to access the same pay as men is that maybe they are not promoted as men, and therefore they receive less pay. So capacity building could be could be a way that ECRI could contribute, and that is the way we're actually contributing to ensure that women are competitive because they have the right skills as men. Going forward now to the question you actually asked me, you talked about the resettlement committee and how we can make sure that it's improved to have more women in it. Drawing from the case of the Sierra Leone hydroelectric project, it really comes down to what are your targets? What do you want to achieve in your project? And that I'm drawing from that project because that's a very beautiful example of how we can have a resettlement committee that has women as much as men, and we have women in decision-making positions. It's really not difficult to achieve. It's just for the project team or whoever is sponsoring that project to say, this is what we want to achieve. These are our targets, and following up with those targets, moving from paper or just talking to actually action. And a lot of times you need another body to ensure accountability. So that is where a regional government like ECOWAS comes in. This is something we've adopted. We want to have more women's voices expressed. Then we ensure that the member states and the project developers actually follow through. So just repeat that. You really need to come up with your targets, and you need to work towards achieving those targets. Thank you.
Thank you. And Josefina, if you could reflect with us a little bit of how, a little bit more about how gender responsive resettlement plans look like, or what would be, according to MCC, what are the minimum requisites that you need to take into account so that your plan is approved?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you for the question. As I said in my presentation, MCC, there's a lot of resettlement in our project. So there's been a lot of experience on what to do on this front. And in terms of our safeguards, MCC has signed on to the IFC performance standards, which includes requirements on how to handle resettlement. And so that's what we follow. And if you look at the IFC performance standards and what they say about gender, there's a few clauses in there, but they're fairly general. But there's a complementary set of guidance notes, and those have a lot more detail and have been quite useful. And I encourage anyone to look at those. In terms of coming up with resettlement policy frameworks and action plans, we do require, for example, that if a contractor, if we hire, or if if the countries that we work with hire a firm to help them prepare a resettlement action plan or a settlement policy framework, we require that they take into account this gender inequality in asset ownership, and to help us prepare context-specific measures that make sense for the country at hand or for the environment at hand. And then we ask that those be reflected in the resettlement action plans and the proposed compensation arrangements. But in reality, it proves tricky. So for example, let's say you are a household with 2 spouses, and there's in a country, marital property is jointly owned. However, the formal owner of the asset is the male. So who does the compensation go to? The head of household and the formal owner of the asset, the couple at hand? How do we handle it? We've had, usually would require separate consultations with women in the context of developing a compensation practice and policy that makes sense. In some places, we required joint compensation of couples. This is really to take into account that when you see and this is complicated by the fact that in many of the countries where I've worked on resettlement, households end up preferring cash compensation to in-kind compensation. And if you just get a significant cash handout and you are settled, if that's just given to the male head of household, you can have the assumption that there will be an equal distribution of that compensation money, but that may not really bear out. And so it's very important to try to work around this issue of the risk that we face, that some people within the household may not be left as well off as they were before the project, which is what the performance standards and resettlement guidance requires that we do. So, for example, for joint compensation, what is the arrangement for having that compensation happen? For example, one practice would be to make sure that the compensation files that are given to a household are jointly signed and their signature aligns for both spouses, and that if, let's say, they get an ATM card to withdraw the funds, that both persons within the household can withdraw those funds and have the ability. So and one must be as concrete as possible, and then also make sure that the firms that are hired to implement and carry out the compensation and carry out the resettlement collect and report to us on data, sex disaggregated data on the recipients, so that we can flag any issues and catch any issues early on as it's happening.
Thank you. It's a very interesting answer, and I still want to ask you one more thing, though. I'm going to ask you to keep it short if possible, because this is the last question that came in for you, which reads, if through your projects or the projects that are supported by MCC, are the male educated to understand what is sexual harassment and may clash with traditional culture? How do you deal with this cultural clashes? Because in this person's experience, what is considered sexual harassment in one place is not necessarily considered sexual harassment in another. I'm not going to comment on that, but the question is for you.
Thank you for this question, and it's an excellent point. In the clause that I referred to on sexual harassment, it does have a one-sentence definition of it, which is the one that we use. And in the context of our projects, of our construction projects, we have, as part of a general set of education for construction workers, required that they actually integrate training on that issue as well. And so, yes, I understand it's there are cultural differences in how people perceive it, but that doesn't excuse unwanted behavior. And so we try to address it through our education, the required education.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. And Rachel, I want to close the Q&A with two questions for you. First one says that it's compliments to the Menengai benefits and the project of that sounds great. This person was interested in learning if the African Development Bank was somehow linked to the Kenya Olkaria geothermal project, which is unfortunately not such a great example, though, in terms of gender or social community work. And the other question for you, which is more positive, is in your projects, such as the Kenya project, did you face challenges? Oh, sorry, I'm reading an old one. And the other question I have for Rachel is with regards to the 2001 gender policy from the African Development Bank. And the question is if it's been updated since then, if it's mandatory gender safeguards, what it has, or if the bank's approach is only to mainstream gender into other safeguards and operations. So if you could clarify those two things for us shortly, would appreciate it.
Okay. Then thank you for those, and thank you for the participant who gave us compliments on Menengai. It's my understanding that we are involved, I believe, we've given, aside from this loan, we've given through our private facility, our private investment, what we call a PRG, a partial risk guarantee, to other geothermal projects. I don't work on all of them, so I know the colleague who worked on that. I'm not sure if it covers Olkaria, because there are different geothermal sites that are being realized in Kenya. So I'm not sure about that. So I can't say specifically about that. But normally what I can say is normally we're required to obviously mainstream gender and social concerns, but we can have an offline. I can verify with the colleagues who worked on the PRG instrument to see what it actually specifically covered. Secondly, about our gender policy that was approved in 2001. The gender strategy I spoke about is valid for 2014 to 2018. It obviously elevates at a higher level gender aspirations. So that's where we stand in all of our projects. The gender policy has to be revised. The revision has already started. It hasn't been completed. I think the way to look at African Development Bank, whether it's our policy or strategy, I would emphasize look more at the strategy for now, because the strategy is much more relevant to what we're currently doing. The goal is that beyond just safeguards, ENS safeguards is just an entry point for mainstreaming gender in our projects, but they're not the only thing. And the Men and Guy project that I explained shows that. If the entry point was just through ENS safeguards or due diligence, then a lot of other things wouldn't have been done. So we go above and beyond that, but we can have a separate discussion. Just to answer briefly to the question, that's the answer. The gender policy is being updated to make it more relevant to the context of our countries and what the African Development Bank is doing currently. Thank you.
Thank you. As I have you on the line, Rachel, and it's traditional for us to close with some final remarks from our panelists. So I would like to ask you if you could summarize in 1 or 2 sentences, what is the main message that you would like our audience to take home with them today? I would like for you to share your notes with us.
Sure. So thank you again to IUCN, the GECO Initiative. It's been a pleasure participating. My takeaways are probably on 3 folds briefly. One is that the energy sector is neither gender neutral or net gender blind. So we have to, by hook or crook, make sure that gender becomes a central part to remove this perception in the energy sector as compared to other infrastructure sectors like water and sanitation and transport. Secondly, there's a need to contextualize gender mainstreaming to the country of focus, the socio-cultural and social economic circumstances, as well as the realities of the energy sector specifically in that country. And thirdly, what I'd advocate is that we should not be doing, as partners at different levels, whether in policy or programs or projects, we should not be doing standalone gender components. We should seek to integrate meaningfully gender considerations into energy structure at all levels. We're not obliged to be focused just on employment or the construction activities or the operational. Everywhere we can fit in gender, we should strive for that, and innovatively and meaningfully. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Josefina, I would like to ask you the same. If you could share with us your final takeaway message for today's presentation.
Sure. Well, the first one I mentioned briefly as I was concluding my presentation, and it's to be as specific and concrete as possible in outlining the gender-specific requirements that you want to have implemented as part of larger infrastructure construction contracts. And this is partly sort of a worlds colliding thing. A lot of the people that we work with and that design these contracts and supervise them are engineers and come with a different mindset and extremely detail-oriented in their requirements, and those that respond to the requirements think the same. So I think it's important to speak their language. And second is to ensure adequate oversight. You can put in place all sorts of nice language you want and requirements that you want, but unless there's thorough and rigorous oversight and monitoring of data, including sex aggregated data. Are you meeting your women's employment objectives? Are women equal beneficiaries or beneficiaries in a way that you set out throughout the course of the project development and implementation? That's just really important for making sure that you ultimately reach the objectives.
Thank you. And Monica, if I could ask you to share with us your takeaway message for today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Anna. And yeah, so my main takeaway is that information is important. And when I was thinking about the final messages, I searched for quotes on information. One read that accurate information is a key part of motivation, and the other said that information is only useful when it can be understood. From the 3 presentations from myself, Rachel, and Josefina, we've talked about how the lack of data has been a barrier, and the fact that a lot of times people don't understand the linkages and makes it difficult for them to carry gender assessments on board when planning their projects. So we really need to put out the information. We need to make it easy for people to understand. The way climate change impacts have been made quite, very obvious and easy for people to pick up and run with. Gender and energy linkages need to be put out there out there for anybody to understand, anybody in energy planning or implementation or management. So information is key, and making it easy for people to understand is very important for us to move beyond just plans and policies to actually seeing gender assessment being conducted and mitigation plans being implemented. And another part I wanted to talk about is that we need to follow through, either as organizations or governments. If we've said that we want to achieve this, we want to have more women represented, as Josefina said, we definitely need to follow through. We have this policy, we have this directive. As a community of West African countries, I look forward to us following through with these plans. Those are my final messages. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we all in the audience look forward to seeing all of you three and your organizations and the governments behind this project's following through exactly on trying to achieve gender equality and increased energy access. I want to thank you, all three panelists and our audience. I think we've had a magnificent conversation today and a richness of data and information that we're very grateful to Monica, Josefina, and Rachel that they have made the time to share with us. To you, our audience, thank you so much for tuning in and for keeping true and joining us every time we have a webinar. Do stay tuned for information on GECO because we may still have one coming, one webinar more before the summer, so we'll keep you posted. And I also want to thank USAID, of course, for their financial support and for trusting us with this topic for the past 2.5 years. On our side, just a final reminder that there is a recording from this webinar, and we will be uploading it to our green platform. And the PDF version of the presentations you've seen today would also be found in our green platform. So give us a couple of hours and we'll put everything together, upload it so that you can go back to it, listening to the recording, or have access to the presentations. On our side, thank you very much for the opportunity, and we wish you a good rest of the day. Thank you.